Hey everyone, I'm Jing. I'm the VP of Product here at Fortis Games, and this is the first in a series of conversations we're going to have with various folks around our organization about the challenges, the wins, the highs and lows of building video games while in a global and remote first studio. So, first off, we've got with us today Steve Chiang, our president, and Shawn Foust, our COO. Say hi, guys.
Your soothing
Hey,
tone is freaking me out, man. All right. Like I'm used to Jang, like, what are you doing? What's going on? How are we going to ship these games? And okay, no, I'm here. I'm present. Hi, I'm Shawn. I'm the COO. How you doing?
I'm Steve. Thanks, Jane.
Uh,
Great to see you, Sean.
Thanks, guys,
You've
for
never said
kicking
that to
this
me in
off
our
with
entire
me.
relationship, Steve.
I
Thank you.
tell, I tell. I thank you for coming to work every day.
Today
You
I
do do
get it.
that.
Falling
we've
off the
got it
bandwagon.
on recording. Oh man, you can't take it back, Steve. So I mean, we've been around as an organization for the last couple of years. We started off in 2021, and just kind of like rattling off some of the basic stats for folks who are less familiar with us. We've got a few hundred folks in more than a dozen geographies around the world. We're working on a portfolio of R&D projects, which we're very excited about. And Steve and Shawn are two of our three co-founders. I'm curious, Steve, take us back to 2021. Like you have been a leader in a variety of organizations. This is not your first startup. You were one of the co-founders of Tiburon back in the day. You've been leadership over at EA, at Zynga, at Warner Brothers. 2021 comes. How did you guys decide to go and co-found a studio to go together, and why global, why remote?
Yeah, cool. Thanks. Yeah, so I met Sean in 2015. I met Kelvin a few years before, more socially. But Sean and I really hit it off, kind of meeting, talking about where the business was going, and that kind of left a, we stayed friends since then, and kind of wanted to look for different opportunities to work together. But in 2021, what really happened was we hit the pandemic in 20. We went remote. Everybody was working afar. Warner Brothers was going through an acquisition or had been acquired by AT&T, and for us, it just felt like, hey, there's a moment in time where free to play is still in the early innings of, you know, kind of growing as a business is obviously huge, but there's still a long ways to go in terms of how games are operated, how you bring delight to players every day, and it just kind of felt like this was the moment to strike it out and go out on our own. And because it was the pandemic, we were all working remote, and it just sort of really opened up that opportunity. I mean, Sean and I really see this world very similarly, that there's a ton of talent. And my sense is like, hey, people are talented, want to live where they want to live. And in some ways, this opens up the ability to just kind of go out and say, hey, you don't have to move, you don't have to change your lifestyle, you can come work for us, and it can be great. So this goal of building, global entertainment, great games, uh, remotely was just this huge sort of. It was just this moment in time that felt like it was the right time to go after it.
Now it's been a couple of years since Shawn, has global and remote lived up to what you thought it would be? Any surprises? Any things that really stand out to you as like, oh wow, I thought this would be the case and it turned out to be, or the flip?
It's kind of complicated. Certain things I think have proven to be pretty true, which is the quality of talent that you have access to is really fantastic. The price point that you can have access to a man month is pretty variable based off of being purely in Silicon Valley versus having like a broader global footprint. So you get higher quality talent on a level that I think is like more competitive. So that works out pretty well. I think the day to day is really interesting. I think it tends to be a bit better for your individual contributors, your engineers, your artists. I think the fact that they can be in an environment that's pretty much catered to what they prefer, which is what I assume their home is, that allows them, I think, to be focused and a bit more productive. Being a manager is like worse. It's like strictly worse from my perspective. And I get why there's a lot of managers out there that are pushing towards return to work, and like I get why they want those things, because it definitely feels different to try to motivate and manage a team when you don't have that direct personal, like in-person relationship. So that's sort of like the balancing act that I feel like I've had to make in a role. Is I love the people I work with. I could have never assembled this team if I could only, Jing, you're in LA, I'm in San Francisco. We couldn't have worked together, right? Like we come out ahead by a pretty wide margin in terms of the talent bar and what we're able to bring in. But the management side, I think, is definitely tougher, right? Less satisfying than what it was at other like startups I've done, things like that.
I know we've tried a variety of different things over the course of the last few years to see how to close some of that gap. Like, could we talk through some of the things that we've tried? What have we learned? Anything that stand out to the two of you?
The first thing I think you figure out is that meetings like proliferate really quickly in a remote environment, and most of those meetings tend to be like extremely transactional, right? Like you put something on a calendar for a purpose, because why else would you have it on the purpose? And the end result is that your day pretty rapidly becomes like a series of transactional, like point driven meetings, which again like sounds like, oh, that's how a workday should work. But creative environments tend to be more like spontaneous and organic, and so a lot of it tended to be like drop in and talk and do those types of things. So a lot of what I've been sort of working towards is like, how do you get to a more free flowing conversation around ideas or thoughts that aren't quite as structured around just pure transactional meetings? Like, what's the right mix between these things? And a lot of that has to do with, for example, giving people permission to call you or just talk to you when they want to talk to you, right? And that it's okay, right? So a lot of people started got into the mode where they can send me a text and be like, hey, hop on for 10 minutes, and like that's fine. And I prefer that over a 45-minute call scheduled for the next day, right? Like, so there's a lot around the balancing of the types of meetings that I think we're still working towards, but I definitely know that it swung too hard into that direction of like purely transactional, purpose-driven meetings, to the exclusion of sort of some of those more like organic conversations around our creative projects and what we're trying to do. So working on that.
Yeah, definitely. Steve, how about for you?
I think there's a couple sides, maybe in the positive. One of the things that we really set out to do culturally was to build this sort of creative culture, as Shawn mentioned, this ability to, there's enough trust that people will speak up, be direct. And that was kind of a key piece. Like we've all been at companies where everybody's thinking something and nobody says it. And that sort of just drives you crazy over time, because you're just sort of delaying potentially a decision, a conversation, you're kicking the can down the road, and you're losing weeks or months in that process. So one of the things that we believed was by being remote, we could also get to sort of the more introverted personalities, the ones who are very happy to just hang out at home and really go deep on subjects. And so the good news is we've been able to find some folks like that, maybe in an office environment might not have been their thing, might have gotten lost in the shuffle. Being able to work remote, spend the time one-on-one is just more comfortable for some folks. So that's been one of the positives. On the same side, some flip side is with trust, it's harder to build trust remotely. As a manager, we've seen that, kind of that trust, that ability to say whatever. It's hard, right? It's hard for people, especially when there's somebody who's their boss or their boss's boss in the room. And that's the part that I think we've kind of been trying to figure out how to solve. We've done a number of different things. One thing was just sort of getting our leaders together to spend some time just to kind of build that trust. But I think that's the hardest part, has been how do we build that trust? How do we get people comfortable? And then you compound that with different countries, different language barriers, different time zones. And it just gets a little bit harder, but that's kind of the challenge that we're really sort of intent on trying to figure out how to solve.
The hiring model has changed a ton from what I experienced in the past. I think like my background's primarily in startups, and startups are really just an exercise of like, you have a vision, you have a certain amount of capital, and people sort of buy into that vision, and that's often why they're joining your company. And so what often happens is that the culture of the company is primarily driven by the founders, and the nature of like how people like get enculturated is often tied to the working environment that they go to every day. And that's like this very like strong reinforcing around, hey, like here's where the culture of the company is. Do you want to feel like you're a part of that, and people naturally adapting to that over time? That does not happen the same way in remote. The person largely has to start really culture and values aligned from their first day, because the sort of like passive constant reinforcement of culture is weaker in a remote environment than you're going to get when you go into an office every day and your social circle is like largely overlapping with the people that you're going into the office with, you're going to lunch with them. Like once those things get removed, they sort of have to start where the company wants to be. And we've changed our hiring model quite a lot to reflect that reality. And that was the thing that we had to learn over the course of the first year, was what you had to insist upon during the hiring process. Where in the past, in the marginal cases, it's sort of like, oh, they'll get here and they'll figure it out and it'll work out. And that was often the case. Yeah, I was more interested in getting the skills inside of the company, and then the culture portion of it, unless they were very clearly not aligned, was going to work out well. It would be fine, and that's not the case for a remote company from what I've seen.
Can you talk a little bit about the ways that we've evolved, how we structure our interview process, and how we assess whether or not someone is showing signs that they are going to be culturally aligned?
The biggest shift that we I think made was we moved into like a prompt oriented setup, which for us, we just start by asking people fairly open-ended questions about things that are related to the core of their job. And by that I might say, like, our common first question is like, what's the most insightful thing you've learned about the game industry in the last 3 years? Try to have it be unique to you. And that's a very hard question to answer. And most people in most interview environments start by talking, and then they sort of see how the interviewer is reacting, and they're kind of adjusting their message along the way to try to get to something. And the interviewer is kind of encouraging them, like, yeah, no, I totally, like that's how that standard interview works. But in the remote environment, most of the time you're going to be working asynchronous, and you're going to have to be putting out ideas and thoughts into something of a vacuum, right? You're going to put something out there and people are going to respond to it. And so we've had to really load that into our interview process, and we've had to load that into the prompt side. I think Fortis tends to be maybe more of a thinking company than like an emotionally driven company. And that also meant that how a person structures their thoughts and presents them matters quite a lot. Like it makes a big difference to their success inside of the company. And it turned out to be pretty non-negotiable. If a person's not capable of doing that work asynchronously and putting out a thoughtful piece that people viewed, as pretty valuable and worth reacting to, then the odds that they were going to be successful in the company were very low. And all of this, I would say, is a radical change in model from what I historically have done across, I don't know, 7 companies now or something like that. Yeah, it's weird. I enjoy it, but it's a lot of work.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the other thing I think that the prompts process allows us to be able to do is like what you were talking about earlier, Steve, where it allows for folks who maybe aren't as extroverted, maybe aren't, as charismatic and comfortable in a live conversation with a bunch of interviewers that they've never met before, to be able to have another method to shine and to take some additional time to be able to lay out their thoughts and show how they think through complex problems, right? I mean, there's definitely been a few folks that I think uh, their structured problem solving and the way that they show up in their strengths really came through in their written prompts over what they were able to do in their live interviews, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, maybe a traditional, maybe just on that topic in person, right? We learn a lot by watching other people. So in an office environment, you kind of see how everybody's acting, behaving, and then you sort of absorb some of that and kind of either fall in line or you say sayonara. But in the remote, you just sort of you lack kind of one of those big areas of observation, learning. And then just getting back to the other piece of that, kind of the more the introverted personalities and sort of the day to day. Just we're really sort of trying to, like, in other companies, the best presenter tends to sort of win, right? The best sort of they might not be very deep, but they can present the argument in a way that the exec understands and approves and moves it forward. And we really want to be more about the thought process, the deeper thinking, the systems, the layers below the surface of that presentation, and that's really where we want to be making decisions. So it's a very specific, direct attempt to try to get to the best ideas rather than the best presentation of some ideas, because it's easy to get caught up, and I'm guilty of it all the time. You get caught up in this person, that presentation. Oh, it was really, really solid, and that's but then when you sort of ask yourself a few questions deeper, you're like, maybe that's not as good as actually this one, but just not presented as well.
That's such like it kind of seems obvious when you talk about it a bit, Steve, but like when I think about the hiring model, and you and I've talked a lot about this, right? Like hiring model's been great, right? You give me any random question, tell me to talk about it, that's not going to be a problem, right? Like I can figure out something to say. And what I found was in most interview processes, things went really well, but I was often not so engaged by the company that I was interviewing with, because I didn't actually like learn a lot about the process or how they thought or how they cared about. It was just more of like a dance sort of, and if you knew the steps, it was going to be fine. And if you could follow the lead, it was going to be fine. And that's really different than I think presenting the company as a set of problems and puzzles that don't have clear answers. And we want more thinkers to contribute to that. And that's sort of a collaborative effort, but we're looking for people that are additive to that process and reflecting that throughout the interview process. It's really interesting because when we get a really solid set of prompts, like they get circulated throughout the leadership in the company often, and we're all talking about them, and I'm really excited about this person because we could see how that person would blend into what we're trying to do and how they could have a big impact on our thinking on these topics. Like that type of thing is really different than how I reacted to candidates in the past, where it tended to be a lot more of, I like spending time in a room with this person, right? Like I wouldn't mind spending 20 hours, in a room with this person. Like I could spend 50 hours a week in a room with this person and it would be fine. Like that tended to be the assessment, which is really different than looking at how a person thinks about problems on like a deeper level. It has all sorts of weird impacts around our like who works and doesn't work inside of the company and how titles elsewhere work inside of the company and that type of things. But yeah, Jane.
Also, the other thing about having the prompts is because of this written artifact and they're shared more broadly. It is, I think, in live interviews, one of the things that can happen is, if you're not in the actual conversation with the candidate, you're like, everything is kind of through the lens of whoever is doing the interview and how they synthesize and what they take away from those conversations. Whereas with prompts, everyone is looking at the same thing and it's coming straight from the individual, right? And of course, there are follow-up conversations. We use them as jumping off points to have deeper and more, I hope, like more thoughtful discussions with the person about their thinking process. But like that core artifact becomes a shared thing, and you can also go back to it over the course of time too. And it allows, at least, I do a variety of interviews as do the both of you, but it allows me to also kind of see, to compare and contrast like the quality of answers, the kind of thinking, where some folks decide to take their questions versus others. And I think it just allows for a better chance that objectivity and equity.
Yeah,
I actually didn't think about the fact
agree.
of why I like that so much until now, because I've been looking at a lot of prompts recently.
Yeah, and I think the hint for people writing prompts would be it's sort of the precision and the conciseness, right? I mean, the people who can get take a
Yeah, I don't
complex
need
thought
80
and
pages on the
yeah,
topic.
exactly.
And
It's
I've
like
We
received
have
80
gotten
pages on the
80
precision in the
topic.
pages.
thought process.
And I read
So,
every
I mean,
page.
yes.
I think so much of the problem um, that I experience when I'm looking for talent inside this industry is the incentives inside of most career tracks are pretty bad for the things that we care about, right? Like at most places, I think the job is understanding the reality of the company that you're at, the range of decisions that people are, it's not even like capable of making, it's interested in making, and the amount of
Comfortable
risk that you
making.
want to take. Yeah, comfortable making, and the amount of risk that people want to have injected in their daily lives. And the answer is that most companies, the range is narrow, the amount of risk that people want to take is low. And so generalized problem solving, like general critical thinking, tends to be underweight as a key skill set relative to like effectiveness at communication and process, like the ability to recognize that we're going from point A to point B, and the fact that maybe we should be going from point A to Z is not really the conversation that people want to entertain. And it fascinates me because most people love games because of the interesting problems and the worlds and the puzzles that get created along the way. But when you start making games, a lot of that universe collapses down. And so what we find a lot with the prompts is a lot of people are just confused on like what we want. Like there's a lot of times where a person kind of comes back and says, like, what do you want? And I was like, I want your best answer to this question. Right. What's the most insightful thing you've learned in the last 3 years? And the person's like, I don't really know what's insightful. Right. I got to remember where I was at for the last 3 years. I changed jobs twice. Right. Like, I don't know what's unique to me. I'm like, man, like, you're just looking for how to win this conversation. Like, you're just looking for all the clues on how to win. It's just not about that. Right. Like, I don't like, it's not the point. Like, the point is you think about this stuff a certain way. How do you think about it? And we'll tell you like what we think about what you think about it, and we'll explain our own reasoning, and that's the basis for the conversation, because you should know whether or not you want to think beside us, right? If you don't want to think beside us, then you'll hate it here. You'll have a terrible time. This isn't us like trying to be snooty or anything. Like that's just,
Yeah.
we have a lot of really tough problems. Like, and we really need
Yeah.
more people that want to think about them with us, right? Like,
Yeah. I think the things that we've chosen to do, because I mean, in many ways, even though we are a few hundred folks strong and we've got, folks in more than a dozen countries, and we've got a portfolio of games that are in the works, uh, we're also still a fairly young startup, right?
yeah.
We just happen to have formed a mid-sized company at a very much earlier point in a startup journey than you typically would see. And Steve, Shawn, both of you have called it this. Like we've chosen basically hard mode, capital H, capital M, hard mode, and I think that's either a really exciting challenge and very, very invigorating. Certainly, that's why I joined, or it's not a fit for where an individual wants to be, and both of those are okay. They're great. I mean, the whole point around interviewing is about finding the right fit, and different folks are going to be at different points in their journey, about different points of what they want out of their career, what kind of set of challenges they want to work on or don't want to work on. And I think, like we've talked about so far, a lot of our interview process has been trying to figure out where folks are and how does it sync or not sync with, the
Yeah.
way that we're approaching things.
Probably boils down to, do you want to spend your time solving problems, or do you want to spend your time carrying out solved solutions, right? And they're different mental orientations, right? If you're working at a company that has product market fit at a certain amount of scale, there's a person that wants to take a game from $1 billion a year revenue run rate to 1.2 billion, and they're really excited about that, and it's a really interesting, fun thing for them to do. They love the numbers. and they just like the certainty that they know the direction and what's important. And then there's a group of people that prefer the problem, prefer to like mull over a range of options and try to figure out the right one. And I think at Fortis, and maybe for the future of everything that I do, though I hope it's Fortis indefinitely, but like I think maybe the number one thing I'll look for in future leaders is the ability to handle ambiguity, the ability to handle the openness, and to try to exert problem solving skills against a wide open field of possibility.
Yeah, my favorite go-to analogy is that sometimes there are parts of game development where a game is in a more scaled and kind of known part of its life cycle, where it feels a lot closer to playing on rail shooter, where like the path is defined and what you're focused on is precision shooting, right? Like hitting the marks exactly on time. And that's a preferred genre for a lot of folks. And then there are parts of game development that feels like open world, super exploratory RPG, and you're like, there's a ultimate
No
goal
tutorial.
with no tutorial. Yeah, exactly. And there's a bunch of different paths that you can go on, and it's not super clear, and there's fog of war all around you, or what have you, and that is invigorating for some folks and not a lot of fun
I
for
love
other
it.
folks. And
There's our Fortis pitch. If you want to play a zombie horse survival game, IRL, join. Uh, it's not quite as grim as that, but it is not too far off, right? Like range of possibility is exciting for some group of people, and the ability to assert a expertise over a known direction is exciting for some people. And sometimes that's the same person, right? Like Steve, you've worked scale, you've worked startups now.
yeah.
I have tended too often to startups because I love the openness of the possibilities. Like I love trying to figure out the 0 to 1 problem. It's miserable, but I love it.
Yeah, we're biting off a lot. I mean, without sort of known games, no IP, we're building new teams, we're building new tech, we're building a new company, we're developing processes, we're trying to win in free to play, which is probably one of the most competitive spaces out there. That's sort of where hard mode came from. But when you sort of think about really the possibility space of what we have and the opportunity we have, it's really this idea that, hey, I mean, other companies, I've kind of hit this sort of ceiling of where the company doesn't want to change and won't make that hard decision, or won't pivot, or won't do what's necessary to take that next step. And the thing that I hope we have at Fortis, and what I believe we're going to build, is really the openness to continue to evolve, change, and get better and smarter and work better and learn. That's just a big focus. And I think that's what I think the long term of Fortis can be, is this company that continues to drive innovation. And with every game we put out, we continue to hire and retain sort of the best people, and we continue to push this industry forward, how people think about games, how people look at games. And that process that we approach, I think we hope that's sort of unique to Fortis, but we hope everybody will want to emulate over some amount of time.
I actually have a question for you, Steve. Like this is something I think about a lot. And I was actually talking with Laterno about it yesterday. You start by creating an innovative product. And the important thing was that there was a group of people capable of creating that product. The product finds success and it scales. And all of a sudden, 90% of the profits in the company are coming from that one innovative product. And that product is innovative at its core, but ultimately being operated by a set of individuals that came there because they were, oh my God, this game, I play this game, I like this, I want to work there. They're not there for the risk-taking 0 to 1 proposition. They're there for the excitement of working on a game that they already know about, and frankly, that there's not much risk associated with carrying it through to greater scale. But those people are now the ones that are commanding the majority of the profit inside of the company. And most of them are not 0 to 1 problem solvers that joins. Like, it feels like that seems to be the end result of most game companies is that the character of what made them like a sophisticated, interesting problem-solving developer in the beginning gets replaced once they find a certain amount of scale. Like, do you just think that's an unsolvable problem, or is it, maybe I've mischaracterized what's actually happening? I'm curious, like, how you actually think about that, having seen that growth a bunch of times now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the thing to keep an eye. I mean, let's have that problem first. Let's have that $1 billion game, and then we can think about that. But you see that, I mean, you look at like the big publishers and the AAA, right? I mean, the most developers working in those companies will say, "Oh, we're a marketing and sales organization. We don't, we focus on these big games and big franchises, and where's the innovation?" So you see that. You see there is a pattern of that. There is a history of that. I think that one of the unique things about free to play is that the publishing, the business, is all wrapped up into product development, right? That's, I think, the beauty of it. So it's not like we take a game and we throw it over the wall. I mean, certainly there are folks that focus on the marketing and user acquisition, but when you think about the economy, you think about like the mechanics that bring people back, the idea that my crops harvest in 4 hours, that's a return mechanic. That's a game mechanic that is driving a behavior, because you're saying to a player, hey, I got to come back in 4 hours if I want to min max these crops. So much of the game is and actual mechanics are actually driving behaviors. So the developers in a lot of ways have a lot more control. But I think, to answer your question, Shawn, I think at this company, like, we know what's important. Like, both things are important. Building that game 0 to 1, taking that game from 1 to 700 million or something is also really important. They're different skill sets, and we value them differently. And trying to understand that and be clear about that, and saying, hey, it's okay if you love this part or you love this part. There's a time and a place. And I think one of the things that maybe Fortis will be new, or will be known for, are just kind of the frameworks and sort of the thinking, and a lot of it comes back to these frameworks. And as we think about a framework for the life cycle of a game and what kind of talent do you need at what point, those are the types of questions that we'll want to sort of work into those into that framework.
So switching gears a little bit, Steve, one of the things I've heard you talk about in the past is that your time at Tiburon early on in your storied history in the video games industry,
Story,
really
legendary in his own time.
legendary
In his own time, Jang.
I'm gonna hang up.
Informed, how that informed kind of your perspective about not wanting folks to have to be in a specific locale, or to have to be in HQ in order to be able to continue to grow and level up in an organization. Like, how has that played into how you guys have really like set up the organization, have chosen to recruit or acquire or teams to join us? Because we should talk a little bit, like, our composition, I believe, like less than around 40% or less of our total population is actually in the US, and we've got hubs in various locales in the world. So, Steve, can you speak a little bit more about that history and what led to your thinking there?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We started Tiburon in Orlando, Florida. We did some work for Electronic Arts and Activision at the time as an independent developer. So you sort of think back in the 90s, you're still paying for long distance calls. You're still, the internet was still sort of a little bit early. I mean, sort of before a bunch of the big, web companies were even around. I mean, we were using a floppy disk we didn't have a network in our office. So you sort of kind of jump back to that point. And I think probably one of the biggest things, we were always the underdog. We were 10 people, 15 people. We hadn't been in the game business for 10 years, 5 years. I mean, I'd been in the game business for 2 years at that point. Made one game, and execs actually didn't like to come visit us. The CEO of EA said he came to visit in like 2005 after we had been acquired for 7+ years, or maybe it was 2007, and he was kind of embarrassed that was the first time he had come to visit. So So there's a little bit of this like, hey, you guys are 3,000 miles away. Do you have working toilets? Well, those are sort of the questions you sort of get. Like, what's Florida like? Isn't it all strip malls and this and that? And then you realize it's warm all year round. It's always sunny. There's no state income tax. Housing's affordable. And you're like, oh, that's okay. I mean, that's, you got beaches an hour or two away. It's not too bad. And you've got Disney World if you're into that. So there was sort of this, always this like, hey, you're not at headquarters, so you're not possibly smart enough. And there was always kind of the challenge of, hey, you guys aren't good enough to design the game. You guys aren't good enough to produce the game. You guys aren't good enough to market the game. And so there was a little bit of that, like, hey, you're not good enough, that really drove us to the point where we were marketing the game, we were designing the game, we were sort of driving EA sports strategy globally from Orlando, Florida. So that was kind of just sort of one piece where it was like the idea that, hey, there's some adage around that, like the farther the way you are from headquarters, the dumber you are. And it's obviously not true, but that was sort of, how you get you're made to feel, right? Oh, you couldn't possibly understand this complicated thing. Well, the answer is, of course, why don't you try and let's see where we land. But so that kind of drove this scrappiness, this push. The other piece was we didn't actually have talent from the game business. So we brought in a lot of university graduates. We scoured people. We hired people who wrote emulators, those early sort of PC emulators for Super Nintendo, NES, pinball, MAME, all sorts of emulators, because those were sort of programmers who were kind of hackers, right? They love video games. They're sort of disassembling ROMs and understanding how to recreate these games. So it was sort of an indication. It's kind of like the early prompt, right? Hey, if you've done this. We also look for shareware programmers from mostly from the Apple IIgs, which was our background. That was our early crop. And so we were just kind of trying to find people on the East Coast that wanted to work in Florida. And, I think over some amount of time, we were able to find these diamonds in the rough. We found these new grads who were amazing. Like, we asked this guy to program a field goal net in college football, put up a bitmap with some transparency. He made a 3D line draw code, vectors that reacted to the ball. And you're like, okay, this guy's new and he's good, and let's keep giving him harder tasks. We were early in terms of disassembling and really understanding the PS2 vector units. We were able to put out a Madden game, 2001 on PlayStation 2 at launch, very, very quickly. And it was because we just had this drive and this push. And so, a lot of it's effort, a lot of it is talent, and a lot of it is just sort of sticking true to what we need to make great games, which is a lot of iteration and continued push and eye for quality. So, you sort of fast forward that and, we look at the world and it's like, hey, I know there are people who are great that are all over the world. And, the idea of being able to get access, find them where they're at, not make them relocate, give them a global opportunity to build something amazing is just sort of, it's kind of irresistible. It's kind of a no-brainer. It's like, that's why we went down this remote path.
I've often looked at talent markets from the lens of how do I think talent's distributed, which I think is evenly, and I think the opportunity is not distributed evenly. But there are aspects about opportunity that are changing quite a lot. So, for example, the barriers to entry for playing games, I think, were really high for a very long time. If you lived in certain parts of the world that didn't have a strong internet connection and your local currency was weak, getting into video games 30 years ago was really expensive, right? A game that went for $40 in the United States is just massively and prohibitively expensive in other places in the world. And a ton of that's changed with the phone. And so now a much broader cross-section of humanity has the opportunity to play the same games as people that are sitting in Silicon Valley or other major development hubs. So the experience around games is not quite as asymmetric between pools as it used to be. The part that I think is still a struggle is you need experience working in games, and that is pretty hard to come by in a lot of places, particularly experience working in companies that are competing with other global companies. The top end of the industry, the opportunities to work there are narrow and not well distributed. So in our case, we've really been thinking about, well, if talent is evenly distributed and we can give people access to the experience, like how long does it take for a lot of those talent pools to come online? How does the cultural fit work, right? Around, between what it takes to sort of succeed in the game industry relative to like what a particular set of work cultures or preferences like might be. And that I think is where a lot of energy has gone in Fortis, is like looking for those talent pools that we think are ready to break through, that grew up on a lot of the games that we think are like the relevant training for the type of games that we want to play, and have enough population, have enough interest, have enough, universities churning out quality engineers and artists. And that's shaped a lot of our talent strategy. And I think, you're right, Jing, more than half the company sits outside of the country. And, a lot of extremely talented people, I think, are getting an opportunity to put their skills against a tougher set of problems than they would have had access to otherwise. And that's super satisfying. And my hope is that over time, more and more of the leadership of the company, as things naturally churn over time, more and more of that leadership starts to be a global pool of people that have worked on these problems for long enough where they have enough bit of experience to drive the major functions of the company. Right now, a lot of us are in California and United States generally. But I hope that changes over the next 10 years.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm as you're saying that out loud, I'm thinking about the folks that are in our that are in Brazil or in our Romanian team. And late last year, I had a chance to be able to be out there with our Romanian team and kind of be on the ground with a number of the designers there, and thinking about one of the designers who's still on an earlier part of her journey, and she just like, I'm fully convinced that in the next 10 years she's going to be a major player in our industry, and like being able to be part of her journey is like is pretty exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, we both of you spoke a little bit about rising junior talent, and I know this is a thing we've talked about before, is particularly in a remote environment. Yes, on one hand, there is a greater degree of access and opportunity, but there's also a lot about learning while immersed with others, and the things that are difficult in remote being potentially even more challenging for folks who haven't had the context of working with other teams, with being alongside uh, folks as they made games together before. I'm curious for your thoughts about, like, Steve, you talked about the fact that especially in the Tiburon days, uh, you guys invested a lot in that junior talent. Has that been part of the Fortis vision for how we would grow? How does that, if it has been, how has the last couple of years been in terms of realizing that vision?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest differences we had when I was at EA was we had product market fit. So we were sort of sequeling in a lot of ways a formula of Madden football, and we're trying to innovate, but it was within some guardrails of launching every year, a certain team size, things like that. I think the biggest change probably with Fortis is, we are trying to create worlds. Essentially, we're trying to build things that connect people in a world that they want to live in, they want to play in, they want to spend thousands of hours in, and that's very, very different sort of problem statement. I was thinking back, and probably one of the most common questions I would get when I was at EA is, when are we going to want to work on? When are we going to work on a non-football game? And and here I am, and I'll say, be careful what you wish for. So it's product market fit sometimes really nice to have because you can focus, but where we're at in the problem space, and it's one of the things that drives this kind of conceptual hard mode, is that we're looking, we have hypotheses around play patterns and what's going to work, but we don't have, we don't have confirmation, and that's kind of what we're seeking out. So, in a lot of ways, in the mode we're in, we need these problem solvers, proactive problem solvers to really sort of help get in and pull apart these problems and put together something that we think will be, and we can test, which will be appealing to players, for hopefully for years. So in some ways, we're sort of, we're trying to sort of build that sort of probably mid to more senior problem set and problem solving and approach. Um, I think as we get something in market that gets to scale, we'll have more opportunities to bring in folks that maybe have never spent any time in the game business and but have a lot of potential. And it's kind of right now, there's kind of we have a first order problem and a second order problem is how I think about it. And trying to get folks from where they are now to that next level of problem solving and impact is probably the first and foremost. So there's a learning aspect, but it's probably not for sort of super entry level.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The vision of the company, I think, involves those pipelines, but Steve's right. There's an order of operations based off of what we need to accomplish when, and right now it tends to be more about in the remote environment. While we're in product market fit search, you should be orienting towards more experienced people for a period.
I would like to think of it more as, I think in the remote environment, there's a higher bar for, or higher baseline, I should say, for the degree of like self-directedness and self-motivation, particularly when we are in still the very ambiguous pre-product market phase. And there are, I think, exceptional cases where you have folks who kind of are just that way, are incredibly self-guided, and are that even at the very start of their journeys. Like the designer was talking about is an incredibly strong prototyper, is very, very self-motivated, and a lot of it is just trying to kind of get obstacles out of her way. But I think that is it's a bit of a rare find, and I think we're still at a stage in our organization where it's like it's harder to be able to do that hands-on coaching, and we don't have a known product market fit thing for someone to be able to jump onto and start to really learn the ropes, right? So all right, so one last set of questions for both of you. I'm curious, for you, what has been the biggest highlight since we've been on this journey in this remote first organization, global organization? And then what has been the most surprising thing for you?
I think the biggest highlights got to be the talent, the team. I haven't had the opportunity to assemble a team this strong before that I had as much conviction in. It's always been solving for a certain amount of funding and a certain amount of time, and the startup reality of that is, especially in Silicon Valley, is that you have very few options on how you're going to construct your team. You make a couple of bets on your founders, and then you build the team you can with the time and resources you have from there. So really, really love the team. And the surprising part for me is that piece I touched on in the beginning. Like I'd say I'm a reasonably devout introvert in terms of my personal preferences. And the remote environment and its benefits are amazing. I thought I would enjoy managing more than I do in that environment. Like that portion of the like wanting that connection. I've ended up just having to travel to see the teams to build that connection a bit more, which I think is general standard practice. But it just surprised me how much I wanted that relative to if you'd asked me in the abstract of this company, like, would you want to do that? And my natural inclination would have been to say, probably no. So that was surprising and interesting to me. Yeah.
Oh, the talent's a good one. I think maybe the best moment was, I think, really sort of the sign that our culture was working. So we talked about, this idea of one Fortis or Fortis first, and this idea of like, hey, look, if we have a game that's working, we're going to scale it, and we may have to move 50 people. And the fact that we're all remote means that that's good news. We don't have to change, move or anything. We have to sort of switch contexts and kind of learn a new game and be able to contribute. And this kind of worked in sort of a maybe a different way where we basically made a call, like we wanted to emphasize a game early in development. It wasn't quite successful yet. It wasn't in market, but we put a game on ice, and we merged the two teams to try to increase the talent density to go after the opportunity. And I think the biggest thing about that, and the reason why it stands out, is really the cultural aspect of. I mean, those things are hard, right? I mean, I've been around a lot of these where you kill a game, and a lot of people rage quit, right? They're like, okay, you're killing my game, I'm out, I'm done. And I thought it was a testament to the culture that we were able to retain everybody. There were some hard conversations. We got a little bit of, we were told off a bit, but by the next day, everybody was back on board, and we were working towards a shared solution. So to me, that's sort of the idea of, hey, making games is really, really, really hard, and it's littered with bad games and people who have quit because the industry's hard. And for us, it was kind of like, we're trying to say, hey, we understand how hard it is to make games. We know it's going to be tough. We know we're going to miss, but we need to learn and continue to get better. And so for me, that was a little bit of that in action. So it was nice to see, having seen the flip side many times. On the surprise side, I don't know. I mean, there's so many surprises. I think an easier one for me personally. I really don't like public speaking, and so when I used to run all hands at Tiburon, we had to, because you're fitting everybody in a room. We used to do 2 sessions, and you sort of get comfortable with it at some point. But the nice thing about remote and Zoom is you're just talking to a camera, so I get no feedback. My jokes go over very, very poorly, but at the same time, I don't have that sort of nervous anxiousness, because you're just it's just like any other meeting, except you're just broadcasting to more people. So there's a certain amount of like, hey, it's easier. It's sort of less rewarding. To Shawn's point, you can't really read the room or kind of get any sense. You can't feed off the energy of the crowd, but it makes it a little less anxious and nervousness around, presenting to 300-400 people.
You can read the Zoom chats. Our Zoom chats are basically
I love the Zoom chats.
They're like Twitch chat internally.
Yeah.
Well, great guys. Thanks so much for having the conversation with me and for kicking off this series. I think that's it for right now.
Thanks, Jing. Appreciate it.
Awesome.
Dave, good seeing
Thank you, Jing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shawn.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks so much for joining us in that conversation. We're going to have more to come in this series. If you enjoyed the conversation, hit the like and subscribe button down below, and we'll see you next time.